Hello everyone, and welcome to the first cut rate Commander Precon Upgrade Guide, the series in which we take a look at Precon decks and bring them up to cut rate standards. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at the Vampiric Bloodline Precon, bringing up its $30 price point to the typical $65 of our usual cut rate Commander builds. Before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as I continue to work on these builds. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and game plan. The face commander of the Vampiric Bloodline Precon is Strefan Maurer Progenitor, a 3/2 vampire noble with flying that costs 2, a black and a red with the following abilities. At the beginning of your end step, create a blood token for each player who lost life this turn. Whenever Strefan attacks, you may sacrifice 2 blood tokens. If you do, put a vampire card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. It gains indestructible until end of turn. So as we can see, Strefan is packing a mid-size CMC, fair stats on an evasive body, and abilities that enable us to accumulate blood tokens as we harm our opponents and ourselves, then letting us use those blood tokens to cheat vampires into play. His first ability provides us with a surprisingly reliable way to generate blood tokens, both via combat, as many vampires have built-in evasion with flying, trample, and intimidate to easily get in for damage, and outside of combat, as both our colors have a multitude of ways to cause life loss or burn to harm our opponents or even ourselves for value, ensuring that we'll have plenty of blood to sate the appetite of our thirsty guests. Then Strefan's second ability allows us to use that blood to lure vampires from our hand into play for free, which is great because many good vampires have quite high CMCs, and the ability to cheat them out not only helps us generate more board presence faster, but also lets us get them out ahead of curve. Now, taking both of these aspects into consideration, I decided to take this upgrade in a big evasive vampires direction with a splash of +1/+1 counter generation. The core deck already has a decent number of big vampires in it with evasion for Strefan to cheat into play, so swapping in some additional low-cost ones to get the initial blood drive going, alongside some bigger entrants to cheat into play, will enable us to make the most out of our commander's blood token generation and vampire summoning. And as luck would have it, there are a fair few vampires and vampire support cards that generate +1/+1 counters, enabling us to make our evasive bloodsuckers even bigger as they take chunks out of our opponent's life totals, turning our smaller vampires into decent-sized threats and our bigger ones into even more terrifying ones. But because we'll be relying heavily on our commander to cheat our bigger vampires into play, he'll undoubtedly be eating plenty of removal spells to keep him from flooding the board with his progeny. So we'll need to do our part to ensure that the bloodline endures by running plenty of ways to protect him, shielding him from most conventional removal so he can keep the blood flowing to feed his growing brood. But enough talk, as our guests are getting quite parched and would like a drink to quench their thirst. Let's see if our opponents are willing to share a few pints with them, or maybe a few liters instead. So now that we have a better understanding of the commander and the game plan we're going for, let's take a look at the cards we'll be keeping from the core build. Starting with the creatures, we'll want to keep most of the potent big vampires in the core build for our commander to cheat into play. Creatures like Bloodlord of Vazgoth, Patron of the Vein, and Necropolis Regent are all great vamps that not only have good stats, but are also evasive to more easily get in for damage and have +1/+1 counter focused abilities to pump themselves or other vampires even further. Anawan the Ruin Sage, Malakir Bloodwitch, Bloodline Necromancer, and Champion of Dusk also keep their spots for being good old-school vampires with vampire synergies to provide us with removal, drain, reanimation, and card advantage respectively, while some new blood with Crossway Troublemakers and Markov Enforcer also make the cut, providing us some huge stat blocks in addition to even more card advantage, blood token generation, and removal for our vampire tribal build. Butcher of Malakir is also a keeper thanks to its big evasive stat line and the ability to make our opponents pay whenever they manage to remove one of our vampires by forcing them to remove one of their creatures as well. Moving on from our bigger vampires, we'll also be including some smaller entrants to provide support and extra bodies to keep the blood flowing in the early game. Cordial Vampire and Rankisher both make the cut despite not being evasive thanks to their +1/+1 counter distribution as our vampires get picked off or get in for damage. Stormkirk Captain and Sanctum Seeker stay in for the Anthem and Drain they provide to make our vampires' attacks even more deadly, and Vampire Nighthawk, Blood Tracker, and Bloodsworn Steward remain in as more reasonably costed evasive bodies to help keep the blood flowing alongside our commander for our bigger vamps. Finally, Camber the Plunderer makes it in as our last creature we'll be keeping from the core build to provide us with some additional blood token generation and incidental life gain as our opponent's creatures die throughout the game to further enable our commander. Moving on to the instance, we'll be keeping both of the removal options from the core build, those being Urge to Feed and Rakdos Charm, the former for its vampire synergies and +1/+1 counter distribution, while the latter for the flexibility it provides while being a source of graveyard hate, back row removal, and sometimes a win condition outright if our opponent's boards go wide enough. Reaching the sorceries, we'll first be keeping the board wipe suite of Vandal Blast, Blasphemous Act, and Olivia's Wrath, all of which are solid wipes to keep both back row and creatures under control for us. Then Night's Whisper and Ancient Craving close out the sorceries we'll be keeping from the core build, as they both provide excellent card advantage for us in our colors. Reaching our core enchantments, Stensa Masquerade stays in for making our vampires much more dangerous in combat, thanks to providing AoE first strike and growing them with counters as they connect with our opponent's life totals, while Underworld Connections makes the cut thanks to its Phyrexian Arena-like card draw for us that also generates blood as we take damage alongside our commander. Now reaching the core artifacts, we'll be keeping all the mana rocks, those being Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Rakdos Signet, and both Charcoal and Fire Diamond, all of which provide us with some solid ramp for us to grow our mana base nicely. Swiftfoot Boots also makes it in to grant our commander protection from targeted removal, as well as letting him swing in as soon as we summon him to get the blood flow started. Then Glasscast Heart closes out our core artifact includes to give us some additional blood token generation, alongside the ability to create chump blockers or weaponize our blood tokens, provided we have nothing better to do with them. Quickly going over the core lands we'll be keeping, untapped mana lands that tap for all our colors, such as Command Tower, Foreboding Ruins, Shadowblood Ridge, Smoldering Marsh, and Tainted Peak will all stay to give access to our colors without slowing us down, while Temple of Malice remains despite coming into play tapped for the early scry it provides. Path of Ancestry and Unclaimed Territory also get a spot thanks to the tribal synergy they provide to our vampires by enabling scry or color fixing, while Myriad Landscape remains to provide us some decent land-based ramp from our land slot. Then we close out with 12 swamps and 11 mountains as our basics. That leaves us with a final tally of 68 cards including basic lands we'll be keeping from the core build, leaving us with 32 cards to replace. But before we move on to the upgrades, let's briefly go over some of the core cards we're swapping out and why. Starting with our creature cuts, Madness and Discard focused vampires such as Falconwrath Gorger, Stormkirk Condemned, and Anji's Ravager, while great additions in other decks don't make a whole lot of sense in this build since our commander isn't equipped to take advantage of them. Same goes for Aristocrats pieces such as Blood Artist and Falconwrath Noble, since this build doesn't use their abilities to their fullest potential. Vampires that don't do enough for our game plan also got trimmed to make some room, with some standouts in this category being Timothar Baron of Bats and Vampiric Dragon, the former underperforming when protecting our vampires in testing and being something that we'll never use to protect Strefan unless we're willing to risk him getting exiled permanently, while the latter being too costly for not enough effect even when cast for free. Nirkana the Revenant, while being a superb reprint and quite expensive, also fell into this category, since this deck has no real mana sinks to take advantage of the huge mana bump she provides. Then the non-vampires got kicked out as well, with Lorraine the Diversion not being worth running in this build despite probably helming a pretty fun goat-themed build alongside her partner, while Shadowgrange Archfiend belongs in a Madness deck, not in a Vampire Tribal one. Moving on to our sorcery cuts, Avacyn's Judgment gets the axe for being more at home in a Madness build, and Feed the Swarm, while being a pretty solid card on its own, loses out to some of our faster removal options we'll be adding in to replace it. Damnable Pact and Imposing Grandeur also get cut here, the former losing out to some better draw options, and the latter being better in a Madness-themed deck or if our commander was more expensive to get more than 4 cards out of it. The more niche picks of Predator's Hour, Sinister Waltz, and Mob Rule also get dropped here, all being a bit too specialized for what they do and, while their effects are potent, will likely find a better home in other builds. For our enchantment cuts, we're getting rid of Molten Echoes and Arterial Alchemy, the former because, while being a fantastic tribal card, actually conflicts with our commander's ability, as he summons in the combat phase so the token copy won't be able to swing before it's exiled, and the latter only being good in this build for its initial blood token creation, as we'll rarely want to use its equip effect over just sacking the blood tokens to summon more vampires or to rummage. For artifact cuts, Commander Sphere and Unstable Obelisk are 2 mana rocks that fail to make the grade due to being inefficient and overcosted, so we'll be swapping them out for some more efficient alternatives. Finally reaching our land cuts, Temple of the False Gods gets the boot since it's an actively bad card to draw in early, and some basics will be swapped out to make some room for utility lands. So now that we've covered all the cards we've kept and cut, let's move on to the upgrades. Starting with the creatures, some more big evasive bloodsuckers will be added to give our commander better targets to cheat out, such as Westgate Regent, Drana the Last Blood Chief, and Drana Callistra Blood Chief, all of which are solid flyers with decent stats that get bigger as they deal damage, reanimate our creatures, and remove our opponent's creatures respectively. Olivia's Attendant and Vein Drinker are also decent evasive additions, with the first packing huge stats, menace, and the ability to pick off smaller utility creatures while generating us more blood tokens, and the latter having smaller stats but better evasion with flying and can pick off bigger targets with its cheap fight effect while growing bigger as it does so. Some more mid-sized vampires then join us with Sangromancer, Imistrum Predator, and Falconwrath Aristocrat, all 3 being evasive thanks to flying to more easily get in for damage, and providing us extra utility with life gain and graveyard hate or just being able to get into combat really quickly. Henrika Damonathi also gets slotted in as another evasive body, her front face giving us some card advantage and removal if needed, while her transformed state makes her into a souped up vampire Nighthawk, who can pump up our other flying vampires to really pour on the damage. Anji Maid of Dishonor also joins the brood, giving us another source of blood token production as our vampires ETB, and later weaponizes those blood tokens for extra reach once we have no more vampires to summon. Then we're adding a trio of legendary vampires with Olivia mobilized for war, Drana Liberator of Malakir, and Florian Volarian Scion. The first being a well-costed 3/3 body and letting us pitch dead cards to make our vampires even bigger if we need to. The second being a reliable source of +1/+1 counter distribution as our flyers get in for damage. And the last giving us a surprising amount of card selection as our vampires crack in, letting us dig deeper into our deck for additional resources. Then we're adding Falconwrath Forebearer as another flying vampire, this one producing extra blood as it gets in for damage for even more blood production alongside our commander, while also being able to use that blood to reanimate itself to make it hard to permanently keep down. Then we close out our new creature additions with Vampire Socialite and Voldaran Bloodcaster, the former growing any new vamps we summon if we keep dealing damage, while the latter gives us yet another source of blood production that we can later weaponize if we end up stockpiling it by turning it into more evasive bodies. Moving on to our new instant additions, we have some protection options with Feign Death and Undying Malice, both of which bring our creatures back with a +1/+1 counter should they die for a very cheap cost. Then some removal options with Go for the Throat and Terminate, both serving as efficient instant speed creature removal effects. Then for sorceries, we'll just be adding some additional draw with Sign in Blood and Pointed Discussion, both of which give us some early card advantage at good rates, more easily allowing us to make our land drops and find big vampires to cheat in, while also generating us blood as we damage ourselves to use them. For new enchantments, we'll be adding a single entry with Blessing of Leeches, which is a great flash speed way to provide our commander with regeneration that costs nothing to activate once cast and only costs us a single life on our upkeep, which can help Strefan create even more blood tokens for us. Getting to our artifacts, we'll be adding 4 more ramp sources with Wayfarer's Bauble, Talisman of Indulgence, Ebony Fly, and Cryptolith Fragment, the first giving us a cheap source of land-based ramp, the second being an efficient mana rock that also hits us to generate even more blood, the third being a bit slow but granting our non-evasive vampires evasion while also turning into another evasive body to swing in itself, and the last, while slow, hits everyone for a damage when we tap it to generate 4 blood tokens per turn, which is especially useful in the early game to get our commander's vampire summoning ability online. Moving away from ramp, we'll add some equipment with Ring of Zathrid, which gets slotted in as both a source of protection for our commander via regeneration, and a source of +1/+1 counters over time to make our commander bigger and bigger as the game progresses. Then we close out our new artifact additions with Mask of Gristlebrand, serving as another way to give our non-evasive vampires flying, gaining us some life, and even getting us some card advantage as a bonus if the equipped creature is dealt with to somewhat make up for the loss. Finally, getting to our land additions, for mana lands we'll be adding Haunted Ridge to give us a reliable dual land to tap for both our colors, while for utility lands we'll be adding Tyrite Sanctum and Voldaran Estate, the former giving us a way to pump our legendary vampires even further with counters and eventually making them indestructible via token to make them very difficult for our opponents to interact with, and the latter synergizing well with our vampire tribal build by fixing our mana and letting us produce extra blood on the cheap or even free depending on how many bloodsuckers we have in play. Then we close out our land additions with Ghost Quarter to deal with any problematic utility lands our opponents may be running. So now that we've gone over all the changes, let's look at this deck's breakdown. Our final build currently has 35 creatures including the commander, 6 instants, 7 sorceries, 3 enchantments, 13 artifacts, 0 planeswalkers, and 36 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 35 vampires, 22 cards that care about vampires, 25 cards that are either evasive themselves or grant evasion, 19 sources of +1/+1 counters for themselves or others, 10 cards that produce blood tokens, 5 cards that care about blood tokens, and 6 cards that protect our creatures, giving us a massive amount of vampires to cheat into play with our commander, most of which are evasive or we can grant evasion to and which we have plenty of ways to support or get extra value out of, alongside a decent amount of counter production to make our vampires even bigger, more blood production to work alongside our commander, and ways to weaponize that blood for more value, and finally a handful of ways to make our vampires harder to kill to make sure they stick around for a bit longer. For general deck stats, we have 10 ramp sources, 10 card draw sources, 12 targeted removal sources, and 3 board wipes, giving us a fairly standard number of core stats. Looking at our mana curve, we have 5 1-drops, 17 2-drops, 14 3-drops, 11 4-drops, 9 5-drops, 6 6-drops, and 2 7+ drops, leaving us with a mid to late game curve that's actually much faster than it appears thanks to our commander being able to cheat our 5 to 6 drop vampires into play ahead of curve for free, as well as most of our ramp being aggressively costed to ensure it hits the board early to allow us to hardcast our bigger spells sooner. The final price then comes out to be $64.90 after upgrades. This price is not including tax and assumes the price you paid for the Precon was $30, and the price of the cards was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For some upgrades, Olivia Voldarin and Olivia Crimson Bride both make potent evasive vampires, the former serving as an ever-growing threat that can eventually steal our opponent's creatures away, and the other giving us a way to reanimate our vampires for another go again and again until dealt with. Vampire Nocturnus would also make a decent addition that takes advantage of our large number of black cards in this build by empowering all our vampires and granting them evasion, while Sorin Imperious Bloodlord would make a good include for his ability to distribute keywords and counters to our vampires, as well as allowing them to cheat into play alongside our commander. Finally, Twilight Prophet is not only an evasive body, but becomes a card draw source once we hit the City's Blessing, which is not an issue thanks to our blood production, and even hurts our opponent significantly thanks to all the big mana creatures we're running, provided we're willing to shell out the cost of the entire precon for a single card. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Let me know in the comments if you like the shorter form video format for precons in the comments, as any feedback would be appreciated. And if this video is well received, look forward to an upgrade build for the Spirit Squadron precon in the near future. Before we close out, again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel cannot grow without your support. And if you feel like showing your thanks by keeping me caffeinated while I work on these videos, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you want to see the latest builds, or click on the link above to see a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.